Welcome back to Historic Investments. Today we're going to do something completely different. We're not going to focus in on a firearm or a group of firearms or even how certain mechanisms have changed. Today we're going to focus on finishes and show how finishes have changed over the years, because we get an awful lot of questions concerning what is a rust blue, what is a salt blue, how can I tell the difference? I don't understand what you mean by a peacock blue or fire blue, or what does strawing mean, and can the strawing be replicated? Yes, no. And in any event, what I thought we'd do is let's examine a variety of guns, some common, some not so common, and talk about how the finishes have changed over time, both in terms of the major components and the small parts. A nice selection of guns that were made over a 50-year period in a variety of different countries. And for purposes of just a general overview, let me just identify them. We've got an 1893 Bittner that was made in Germany that we can compare to an 1893 Styer Revolver made in Austria. We've got another German gun, and this time it's an 1896 Bergman. We've got a gun made in the United States. It's a Smith & Wesson Model 1917, made up as a kind of a replacement backup gun for World War I. We've got a 1929 Type 14 made in Japan. We've got a Luger here. This is a Mauser Luger dated 1938. We've got a Astra 400 made in Spain in 1941, and we can compare that to the finish as used on this Walther PPK made in Germany at about the same time. The first two of these guns are really interesting because they were made really within the same year, at least plus or minus within a year. The Bittner on the left was made in 1893. It's got a brown barrel and a case-hardened receiver. Now, the browning was applied very much like the rust bluing over many coats, and the only difference between the browning as applied to, say the flintlocks or a number of percussion guns, and the rust bluing, which was a little bit of later development, is the actual components in the mix. But both of them were a multi-step process where the parts were coated with this oxidizing solution, allowed to very superficially rust, were carded, rusted again, carded, etc., until the desired tonality was achieved. The color case hardening is a completely separate process where the parts are immersed in a kind of a carbon mixture, and it allows the carbon to leach into the superficial metal. There are different ways to achieve this leaching or superficial hardening. Some of them give you a gray finish. For example, the finish is seen on the broom handle hammers, at least for most of them, and the subframes, which is kind of a uniform gray. If you vary the components a little bit, you get this kind of a rainbow effect, which is far more attractive. Now, at the same time that Bittner was using the browning for the barrel and the color case hardening for the frame, Styer in Austria was using more modern rust blue, which instead of giving a brown tone, gave more of a grayish blue-black tone. Also, as the parts needed to be just treated a little bit differently in terms of the metallurgy, you can see that the hammer, the cylinder, the crane, the trigger, and all the screws were strawed. Now, that is not an oxidizing process. That's simply a heat treating process. It's a lot harder to oxidize and card and recard a small part. So rather than subject them to that kind of very tedious, labor-intensive steps, it's much easier and actually more attractive to give them a heat treatment, which will change their colors either from a straw, which is this kind of a very attractive yellow, or you can also get a brownish tone or a purplish tone or a blue tone. And even though it's kind of faded on this revolver, the front sight and the lanyard ring were originally given a blue tone that simply required heating the parts up to a heavier temperature. And I think for just purposes of the display, why don't I just kind of cone in here a little bit more so you can get a better appreciation of both the rust blue and the tonality for the strawed parts. I should point out that in the majority of guns, not all of them, but the majority of them, when they were rust blued, the barrels tend to be polished later and are in the white. I mean, not the barrels, but the muzzles. And you'll see that's true for the Lugers, the broom handle Mausers, and here you notice the same thing on this 1893 Styer Revolver. So at this point, let's turn to the 1896 Bergman. And at that point, the rust blue process was very much the standard of care as far as firearms were concerned. The Bergman offers a very interesting mix of finishing processes. As mentioned before, the major components, the barrel, the receiver, in this case the frame, were all finished. The major parts were all finished with a rust blue. And as per the 1893 Styer, you can see that, yes, indeed, the muzzle has been polished and is in the white. Now, what about the small parts? Well, in this case, there's a very nice mixture, and I'm going to cone this in a little bit more of between these strawed colors. Again, these are heat-treated parts. It's not a matter of putting on that oxidizing mixture and allowing it to rust, but you see a nicely strawed hammer and trigger and this little retaining spring unit. And we see right here, this bolt is also strawed, and the safety, though, is brought up to a higher temperature, and that's why it now has assumed just a beautiful peacock blue or a fire blue color. So both of those terms are interchangeable with the kind of coloration you're seeing in this image. 20 years later, in 1917, 1918, Smith & Wesson was using a very different kind of process, not a rust blue. It was more of a fuming blue, in which the parts were put in a rotating drum and allowed to contact some oxidative elements. That explains why the hue is a little bit different than the slightly matte finish of the guns that were previously videoed. But what Smith & Wesson was still doing, though, is color case hardening the small parts. And you can see a beautifully color case hardened hammer and a color case hardened trigger. And then if we turn the gun just a little bit and cone down here a little bit more, you'll also see that the lanyard ring is color case hardened also. In this case, the lanyard ring is a little bit faded, but you can certainly understand the process now. In 1929, the Japanese were finishing their small arms with a combination of rust blue for the major parts and heat treating the smaller parts, as is evident in this Type 14. And as I had pointed out for the previous guns, yes, this one too has a polished muzzle. And if we turn the gun around, it's kind of interesting that if you're not familiar with the Nambus, or let me cone it down just a little bit more, they're all dated on the right side of the receiver, starting with 1925. So this is the 4th year afterwards. So this is in 1929. Then there's point and then the month. So this particular gun was made in June of 1929. So here we are, Germany, 1938. Well, one of the first things you can see is these small parts are no longer independently heat treated. So you can see that the trigger and the takedown lever and the safety, that on maybe earlier production Lugers, if you're familiar with them, those were all strawed parts. Well, not anymore. Ever since 1937, Mauser had been using a salt blue, whereby all of the parts, both major and minor, were just simultaneously dipped into a salt bath, and that also includes the grip screws. So if you see a Mauser pistol that was made after 1937, in other words 1938 and later, that's got some strawed small parts, you'll know that that is not work that was done by the factory. So it's always kind of good to know how different factories change their finishing process over time. Well, so here again, you've got a very interesting situation. You've got two guns that were built in two different countries, both in 1941. To your left is an Astra 400, to your right is a Walther PPK. Well, in 1941, Astra had not yet adopted to using a salt blue process. It was still, labor was cheap. Adaptation was kind of a labor-intensive and expensive proposition, so, well, why not? Why not just continue using the rust blue? So, as per some of the earlier guns we've seen, we've got the slide and we've got the frame, and some of the other major components like the grip safety were rust blue. But if we're really going to take a closer look, let's cone down here. You can see that there we go. There's the extractor that is fire blued right there. The grip screws are fire blued. The magazine release is fire blued. So the manner in which this particular gun is finished is actually not that much different from the way Bergman was finishing their pistols in 1896. So what about Walther in 1941? Well, Walther had already made the conversion to salt blue. I mean, after all, come on. It's just a lot easier to dip all the parts in a salt blue bath rather than to do this individual cardings. But the conversion does take time, and as I mentioned, it is expensive. So when you look at this Walther PPK, made again in 1941, you can see that the slide and the frame are salt blued, and that means if you took the gun apart, the inner guts of the gun would be salt blued the same way and have the same tone as the outside, the only difference being the polishing. but the conversion is kind of a stepwise and expensive process. So then if you also look, and let me cone down a little bit more, if you look right here at the safety lever, you can see that the safety lever is still fire blued. And if you look at the extractor, here we go, here is the extractor, there we go. And you can see that's fire blued. But if you were to follow the Walther PPK production for just another couple of years, you'd find that all of the components, both major and minor, were now salt blued. So there you have it, a variety of guns, a variety of finishes over a 50-year time frame. And remember, even for a single manufacturer, the finishing process can change over time. So before you decide to plunk down a ton of money on a particular collectible, do your homework. Remember, knowledge is power. Good luck and good collecting.